And we are live with our 80th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Yeah, Seth, I almost got it, Seth.
I almost got it.
Dang it.
Hey, everybody. I don't know what it is. Ken's been doing this for 80 episodes now. For the last like 3 or 4, he can't get his like intro together. So we are finally back. Again, I apologize for last week. Deciding to catch the flu was never on my list of things that I wanted to start 2020 out with, but it happened. So yeah, we're back this week with Louie, and we're going to be talking all things Cert and getting into the industry. But we did want to catch everybody up on other stuff that's going on, since it's been about a month since we've been live, right? Since we've actually had a podcast.
Yeah, I think it has to be at least a month, right?
Yeah. But I mean, thanks for sticking with us. This is the start of our 3rd year, Ken. I was thinking about that.
Dang.
Of doing the podcast. We started, in 2018. So 2019, 2020. Yep. First and foremost, next week, I will be in AppSec or in Cali for AppSec Cali. Decided that I'd run down and actually say hi there. I'm not actually speaking again. Just going down to see Leaf and Louie. Are you going to be there at AppSec Cali? Or are you guys
actually planning to do?
You're going to skip it.
Yeah.
Jeez. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We can convince you to go down. It's not too far from you guys. So
yeah, it's close enough. But prioritization, of course.
Yeah. That's always the issue when it comes to all the conferences that pop up is what's available and what's there. I'm trying to think what else besides San Francisco. I'll be there in a couple of weeks or about a month as well, running a workshop on secure code review. In that case, that one's not going to be our full course. That's going to be more bring a code base and let's go ahead and hack on it and see what we can find. So actually implementing the secure code review process. I think that's everything on my end. Ken, what else did you want to talk about before we jump into the show?
I guess I'll tease the fact that we planned this year on putting some of that course, pen to paper, and starting to get that down into write it down and maybe distribute it. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah. That's a project for this year that we want to do. We want to make a book, so we might go that route. So. But yeah, we got those shirts in too. So we've got it, Louie. We will be sending you a shirt as well. So we'll get the address to send them to you in your size. But so we've got some new shirts, and yeah, I don't think there's anything else other than you are feeling better. I'm super happy that you're feeling better, and happy that Louie's here and we can kick off 2020. This is our first show of 2020, so yeah. Good stuff.
A continuation of the professional podcast that we host. Yes.
Yeah. The last one we did was we're actually at this DevSecOps Days Austin. On stage. That was I think we learned a couple things from that. One was that we need some higher end cameras. The audio was actually surprisingly okay, and so was the video, but definitely we could go with like a higher. I'd like to do it again. I think we want to do it again, but we just need to make sure that we bring some higher end equipment so it's a little bit nicer looking. But hey, like you said, we're not the super profesh podcast, so whatever. Anyways, so I'm going to introduce Louie Barrett from Segment. Louie is a senior security engineer on the security incident response team. We were talking about before the podcast, like the whole trials and tribulations of basically the Cert team, and we've got our own Cert team, and we'll get into all that. But yeah, it's certainly not an easy thing to do. But Louie, say hi. We're gonna kick it off.
How's it going, folks? I'm Louie Barrett. I work as a senior security engineer at Segment, like Ken mentioned, and basically my day-to-day consists of lots of threat hunting, making sure our logging and monitoring pipelines are working as expected, and we're getting the right signal from all layers of our both product and application stack.
Cool.
Very cool. Yeah. And we're going to delve into exactly what all that means and, you know, what it's like to work on Cert, because it's not an easy life. It's definitely, definitely a difficult job. But like I said, we were talking about it, and I know the team on GitHub's always busy. Lots of love to them as well, because it's very difficult. But yeah, usually what we start with is sort of your origin story, your background story, how you got into this field. And yeah, just tell us a little bit about how your journey.
Sure thing, guys. So I guess where it all started, if you want to really have this be an origin story, I was born in Jamaica. I moved to the US in the mid 90s. And when I got here, I hadn't started school yet, but an older cousin of mine had. And at his school, they had basically a program where they taught you how to build computers, install operating systems, and basically just bootstrap yourself into learning how computers worked. So he went to this program, built his computer, brought it home. But I wasn't going to school yet. So while he was at school, I'd be messing with his computer, taking it apart, and just doing, God knows what, but always have to put it back together before he got home, right? Otherwise, there would be obvious problems.
Yeah, ramifications, I'm sure.
Exactly. So through that experience, I got a bit familiar with how computers worked. And this was like the MS-DOS days, Windows 3.1 days, to kind of date myself there. And the following year, I ended up going to the same program, but because I had already had a bit of the experience just kind of messing around with my cousin's rig for that year, I kind of just went for the experience of getting access to the technology, which I think is like the most important thing, like in developing some of these skills, just like really access to resources. Following that, I'd kind of always been the kid in class who, there was a computer issue, the teachers would come to me. We were at a fairly underfunded school at the time, so we didn't exactly have the city's help with a lot of the IT issues we had. So that kind of fell on me to learn how like Nobel NetWare worked and do some of that administration where the city wouldn't. And this was like, I was probably about 12 or 13 at the time. So like that natural interest progressed into doing some IT consulting, originally around just like help desk stuff, because that's usually your first leg into anything IT or security related, is doing user support. So I did that for one of these big box stores. So think about Best Buy or Circuit City. In this case, it was Circuit City on their FireDog team. And during that experience, I got lots of exposure to just the wildest kinds of user issues, the weirdest malware that people would get from random websites and stuff like this. And like through the experience,
No, I was going to say that's super interesting, right? Like one of my first like real gigs at like when I was in college was working on the college help desk, right? And this is pre-Wi-Fi days, and everyone would come to school without like any sort of like, so similar stuff, right? They'd just bring in their computer, it's not working, and they offered the help desk. It wasn't just like staff; it was like any of the students had problems with their computers, they'd bring it in. Right. And I mean, so similar stuff to what you're dealing with, like you're going around, I'm sure, to people's homes and, you're dealing with rats' nests and, like mice inside computers. Yeah. Yeah.
I get away from that stuff. Like no more. No more. Yeah.
Yeah. You think of the computer as being clean, but inside those cases, oh, no. Right. Like it's
I don't miss that
much. Yeah.
But yeah, they're definitely like, helped me get more exposure to just like different systems, different kinds of issues. And luckily at the time, Circuit City actually had the program where they would let you get Microsoft certs.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which was pretty rare back then. These were fairly expensive, especially for like a kid in high school at this point. I didn't exactly have, the means to, buy these vouchers and take these tests on my own at the time, just basically working a summer job essentially. And I used their voucher request system, which for whatever reason was not capped the way they thought it was. So instead of getting 2 vouchers, I got about 6, took a bunch of cert exams. And that basically helped me say, hey, yes, I can do this thing and prove that to somebody. Since before that, I had basically no experience on paper, despite messing with computers for years.
Right. And troubleshooting at school. And
exactly. But you can't really quantify that to employers. Which is like another reason when I have some candidates come in for roles, I really try to like see what their real foundational experience is more so than what they have on paper, since that doesn't always come through.
I do feel like there are folks such as yourself, Seth, and I, and others watching the podcast that like now are in the position to hire people. And so the awareness is more there, but certainly like, I don't feel like when I started, the awareness of, this person, yeah, clearly they've spent time around computers, but it's not formalized. It was still, when I joined this field, it was still like, must have a master's degree and like, have all that experience. And you're like, this is a junior role.
Exactly. Like one of the reasons it was so hard early on to actually break into security, since I knew from like the early days of circumventing certain controls in my school's network that this is what I wanted to be doing. But these roles weren't as formalized or as available at the time. So I got into the whole IT consulting side of things. Again, just to get more exposure, learn different types of systems, and just kind of like, really fill out that knowledge. So after those vouchers, I was able to get into an IT consulting firm because I had certs at this point, saying, hey, this person at least knows Windows XP or whatever it was, just as a leg in. And some of my first clients that I had were like, K-12 schools. So a lot of the same issues or same problems I saw working in consumer IT for a big box store, I saw similar things in K-12. So I did really well there. But I still knew that's not what I wanted to be doing long term. Obviously, I wanted to work in security and not in just like a help desk level capacity. So I left that job and joined a reinsurance company, a multinational organization in this case, that was pretty lean on their IT side. So they needed a lot of help. I was actually brought in just to do one simple job, which was check if HP servers were expired in terms of their barcode, whatever the thing was. Like, is this thing out of warranty or not?
Okay.
It's a 1-week project. I don't like doing things manually. They want me to go around to the server room, just like scan these things by hand. That seemed like it was kind of a waste of time. So I automated it. I used WMI, pulled some details back, and I was done in about 2 days. And I thought I did a really good job. But what I didn't realize was you're not supposed to finish a week's worth of work as a consultant in 2 days.
In 2 days.
That's wrong.
That's true.
So
yeah.
Because of that, I was actually in a position where I no longer had that job technically. Say, hey, you're actually done, so we have nothing more for you to do. But luckily, someone saw me do that who was in the engineering group or the infrastructure group. And it's like, wait, no, this guy just automated a week's worth of work in 2 days. Let's see what else he can do. So that basically led into me working on their infrastructure team with like pretty much full autonomy since they had different divisions. And I was supporting their trading floor both as a help desk analyst and also as a server administrator. And that's kind of how I cut my teeth on Windows internals, AD, and all of that stuff, which later transitioned to some of the security work. So I stayed at that company for about 8 years. They basically let me do whatever I want, which is really good for like a young kid coming in who is really hungry and wants to touch different areas of the stack or the company. So like that was pretty much my proving ground for all my security work. And that's one of the first places that I took a security role officially. And built out their team and also their monitoring and alerting stack.
I think that's so important that
segment.
Yeah, I think it's so important that somebody like that we all recognize somebody that comes in and then like, has sort of that recognizing what you did and then also trying to help push you in that direction, because there are a lot of people that are trying to like build their careers and all they need is like one person to sort of just recognize what they're doing. You're putting in the work. You're doing something. Obviously, most people would have just done the mindless job of going to each individual, and scanning. But you automated it. So I think it's important that people do recognize that kind of hunger, like you said, and help folks. It only takes one person. So
exactly, and there are people who I really appreciate in my past for giving me that opportunity, because again, on paper, it wasn't as clear that I had the skill set. I didn't go to a 4-year college; we couldn't afford it. So while a lot of my friends were, going through these 4 or 6 year programs, getting their masters, I was, working every day on various IT problems, and that's how I got my experience. It was pretty interesting to see, like when they graduated, kind of the difference level in our experience based on what we were exposed to, even while we were in the same field. So I really think it's important to acknowledge alternative paths into the industry, because there is like a richness of experience you can gain by taking those alternative paths.
We have this discussion quite often about the fact that there's no one true way, right? Like, and I know that a lot of people have, I don't know, I'd almost argue that half the people that are in the industry that I really respect probably don't even have a degree. I don't know, I've never asked them, but I know there's quite a few people, especially, I mean, you were around for the whole, you know, Web 1.0 stuff, and like anybody that could like read HTML markup was a programmer and became like ultra rich, apparently. But like that pathway into security, like you said, it always kind of comes from, hey, who do you know? Like, how did you represent your skills? Improving the situation that you're in. Right. Is where it stems from, right? Like, you know, I think back to my startup as well, as like just the fact that, you know, like my parents, like, you know, like they couldn't have afforded like a new computer by any stretch in the situation that we were in. And, you know, my dad doing some, like, he was a photographer and doing some like crappy photo work for a catalog, and they gave him a computer as payment. Right. And that was basically it. It was like a used computer that they gave him as payment. And they brought it home. And that's what I cut my teeth on. Right. That's what I was using to war dial, like way back in the day. Right. And I was like, I think about that now, and like the amount of like technology that I have just sitting around the house is that I don't even turn on is ridiculous. Yeah. Right. It's ridiculous. God. Yeah. Like, you know, the little like Raspberry Pis have more power than that computer.
Oh,
but at the same time, those opportunities and being able to say, hey, at least you were able to mess around with something, and like you did with your cousin, right? The pressure of, you know, screwing something up and then having to fix it by a certain deadline, there is no substitute for that pressure, right? In a business sense, right? If you had the money to just go to school and learn, like there's not necessarily the same sorts of deadlines or pressure there as when, oh crap, I just screwed up my cousin's computer and it's not going to work. He's going to kill me, right? That's a different,
like by 3 p.m. So it kind of translates pretty directly into the pressures of working on a cert. You also have these deadlines, more so come to answers than to, you know, put a thing back to normal basically, or do a remediation. But I think it's usually a signal we can even test for early on is how people deal with those kinds of pressures, if they have the grit to like kind of power through it, or if they'll fold and just throw their hands up in the air. I think it's like a really good way to measure whether or not someone can be successful in security, because as we all know, like you're going to fail a bunch along the way. And if you're not comfortable with that, it will kind of hinder you in becoming successful.
Yeah. I mean, I think that pivots pretty nicely into, you know, sort of the adaptation part of your job. I mean, there has to be so much where you're just sort of adapting to a new threat or using some other technology that, you know, somebody might have stood up the. Well, I'm not saying at Segment. I don't want to put anybody out there, but you know, we'll say, say a technology went out there that you weren't super familiar that was supposed to be out there, or you weren't sure that. It got out there.
Definitely an era of that where you kind of have to adapt daily. And that flexibility is also something that I try to test for when we're interviewing folks for Cert, because if something is very real, I have to context switch like literally at least 10 times a day. This is going between triaging alerts that are coming in, triaging bug bounty reports to see if we have, for example, that condition actually being abused at any layer of our application or systems. And also I'm continuing to build and automate our processes on top of it. So basically changing those gears throughout the day can be pretty taxing. So one thing I found really to be like a good way to manage that, at least, is to cross-train your team. Like the other members of the Cert team should be able to pick up some of that, either threat intelligence work, instant response work, or whatever it is, and just kind of have a balance. We could time box our work and kind of shift things between team members so that we can work efficiently. Because we know that we're going to be overworked or inundated with lots of different kinds of tasks coming in. And the only way to really tackle that is to automate, delegate, and pray, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, there's always that.
Automate, delegate, and pray. I like that.
There's always a little bit of, there's always going to be a little bit of risk, right? So you kind of, and that's this. We were talking about this before before the podcast even started, where it's like, the reason I say that I really admire the Cert team that we have, and anybody who works in Cert period, whether like whatever company, is because you have the constant new stuff coming at you. You've got a constant daily barrage, and you have to be available. Like what I was saying to you before the podcast was, for me, if something like, let's say a bug bounty researcher, I think the example I used was a bug bounty researcher who says, here's a vulnerability that I've discovered. And maybe it's serious enough that, we sort of have to, we look at the root cause, find anywhere else in the code paths that might be similar, give a recommended fix. And then the real work starts. Like from AppSec, at that point, I just like hand it off to the Cert team. And then they have to go back and figure out if they have to coordinate with all kinds of teams. They have to be available. I mean, that's the other big thing, is just you're always available. Like for me, if it's a Friday and it's 6 o'clock and this happens, it's like, all right, well, I've just given you all the details. Now this is where Cert continues through the weekend, working with the engineering teams and whoever else to figure out if it's been exploited, what to do, who needs to be contacted if they need to be contacted. It's a very difficult job. So I imagine on top of the difficulty of finding people, it's just hard to like keep people from burnout, and just.
Yeah, that's something that I've tried to be better about in the past few months. I'm used to working on very small teams. It's also how I kind of develop an automator's nature in that sense, because I know that if I don't have the resources as people, I have to have the resources as bots or code to kind of handle some of these problems. So to manage the burnout, like we do have, unlimited PTO, obviously. And for the first time in my life, I actually took some weeks off in a row. This is like a new thing for me. But it also comes down to like the delegation aspect I mentioned earlier, being comfortable with the level that your team members are at, that they can take on some of this work and things won't be missed. So like I'm actually in a pretty good place here at Segment in that regard, that the people we brought on for Cert have like performed really well. So that gives me the comfort to not burn out basically at that point. I think that's really what boils down to, is having that support.
I mean, how do you, if you're finding somebody who's like, if you're say you want to find somebody who's like maybe not as experienced, but because just going back to what you were saying before, if you want to find somebody who's maybe not as experienced, but they have the underlying skills, you and I talked a lot about before the podcast, like having that fundamental foundation of just like IT knowledge. But I mean, how do you go about sort of, it sounds like an adaptation is one necessary thing, having like being able to manage difficult situations, but in order to delegate to people, you have to trust them. So how do you kind of like, how do you find those people? What are the characteristics that you would trust?
So there are a couple of things to that. There's the aspect of grit. How do they work through tough problems? Do they throw their hands up in the air and give up, or do they kind of power through it? And if you leave someone to solve a problem, how many approaches are they taking to this problem before, asking for help or touching base with you? And that kind of helps to show whether or not they can be autonomous. If I see that someone is basically a self-starter, I will dump every piece of information in my head into them to make sure that they're successful. So like we do basically daily brain dumps, and we'll switch between like our blue team and red team context. Thinking like the attacker is a big part of also how we like train folks for Cert. As I basically consider all the options of how something can be exploited or how a system can be abused, and where the signals of that abuse would show up in various levels of our logging stack. So it really comes down to training your team members and more senior people being willing to share that experience and not just throwing their headphones on and going into a bubble the whole day and not training up their comrades there, because it really does benefit the person training them in the long run. They'll find things that you may not have found because they have a different view on some of these IOCs or indicators, and also have just different life experience that might highlight some conditions you wouldn't be aware of. An example I can give is we recently were doing a threat hunt. This is actually related to the whole situation with Iran right now. I don't speak Arabic, but a member of my team can speak and read Arabic, and he noticed something that I never would have noticed in the way a certain string was written, right? And it's just that kind of cross-training and also bringing people in from more diverse backgrounds that can really help things move forward in ways that were kind of unimaginable years ago. So
you're not just responding; you're detecting. You're
a big
trying to make
hunting. Yeah.
So then, well, you know what? Actually, let's maybe back up then. Let's
Sure.
talk about an average week. You know, what's an average week look like for a Cert team? You know, what's sort of part of your day-to-day
Sure.
tasks in a week?
So like for our day-to-day, it's kind of variable, but it also depends on the level of maturity that your Cert program is currently at. If you're only at the stage of like having some logs, you might be able to do minor threat hunting and generate some alerts. Once it's more mature, like our program is here, you're able to actually dedicate a few hours a week to doing official threat hunts. So day to day is basically we'll come in, we'll look at the health of our monitoring stack, making sure that's all nominal. We've built with some resilience in place so we shouldn't have to babysit it. Basically, if I'm gone for 6 months, it should run on its own. It shouldn't fall over. And that's one part of it. Like the actual DevSecOps, are we building the right systems to help us either do instant response, threat hunting, or just get a reputation on an IP or an IOC?
Okay.
There's the other portion of it, which is responding to incidents, things that are confirmed that come in, or we'll have to triage this using the logging stack we built and also some open source technologies. There's the aspect of it where we have to, follow up with bug crowd findings or bug bounty findings around possible issues in our application, which is also another instant response task. There's review for certain anti-patterns we discovered through our logging and monitoring. So there's the user education portion of it. So we're usually going to some of our engineering users, since we are an engineering org. People are, very well versed in their own technologies and things they're working with. So we typically are the ones who go to them instead of IT in this case to say, hey, this is a problem because of X, right? In terms of like certain configuration issues or things along those lines. And there's also the adversarial simulation. We also take that on Cert as well, because that helps us to tune our detections. So for example, like once a week for 30 or 45 minutes or so, I'll say, hey, I will run this particular attack in one or more accounts or on an endpoint, and then see how those detections play out with the other members of my team. So can you detect what I just did on the network? So it's kind of a purple team type approach, but still
so I have
those detection rules.
2 questions from there.
Sure.
A couple times, forgive my ignorance, a couple times you've mentioned IOC, and I'm not familiar with that term.
Oh, really? Okay, great. So that's indicator of compromise. In this case, that means anything that we see as a unique string or something we can use to gain more context on an event or alert that came in. Say, for example, we have someone attempting to brute force our web page login or something like this. An IOC in that case might be the IP address they're using. It could be the user agent. It could be the user ID or anything along those lines. Basically anything that helps us to say, hey, this is the same attacker, or this is a pattern we can now detect.
Okay. Now that totally makes sense now. Yeah, when you use the term, I just wasn't very familiar because obviously my background's it's more in the AppSec realm. The other thing is because my buddy, we've had him on the podcast a couple times, Chris. Chris Gates, he has mentioned, and he's talked about adversarial threat simulations and or attack scenarios, and I'm curious, like what kind of makes those successful? Like, how do you run? What are the kind of the main things that you should do to make that seem like realistic and actually helpful? I mean, is there a point at which it's too subtle of an attack that it becomes like hard to sort of even for? I mean, I honestly have no idea.
Like, there's 2 ways that can be approached. There's kind of a black box and white box method to it. In the black box approach, you can think of a pen tester or someone coming in doing this to see if a response team will actually detect this condition and respond. That's not what we're doing here. What we're actually doing in this case is kind of the white box method, saying, I know what I should see when I run these commands or use these tools against our services or endpoints. And do we actually see that in the logs? And do we get alerts generated for that? So it's basically fine-tuning our system through the use of typical attacker methods. And that's why it's more successful typically than just blindly attacking a system and hoping that the response teams see this come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're sort of just making sure
or whatever and translate that into detection rules, for example. And Pawpaw, if you're not familiar, is an AWS attack simulation tool.
Okay.
Yeah. So that actually dovetails into a question that one of the listeners had that Ken Toller had. around creating IOCs for application-specific attacks instead of stuff that's necessarily mapped to attack. Is that what you're doing to customize that?
It is.
Running like Burp Suite or whatever else to actually see, or
not running Burp per se. Like I do like a lot of custom tooling, just faster and easier for me in this case, since I don't typically need the bell and whistle with a Burp or a Zap to accomplish some of these things. But the indicators that we would be using in this case are related to the level of the stack that we are testing against. So if the web application we're testing and not, for example, the AWS management layer, the IOCs there could be the user ID of the person logging in. They could be the location they're logging in from, the rate at which these commands are being executed, and basically anything that helps us at that layer 7 to determine that this is the same person, right? And if we were an endpoint, for example, we could drop a binary on there and see if this is showing up in the endpoint data recorder logs. So it basically is tuned depending on what layer of the stack we're looking at this from.
Cool. I mean, that makes sense from both from an engineering perspective and a protection perspective. Solely, hey, I want to respond to something. You got to be in that specific layer, and you want to know the attacks that are there.
Right.
That's always been one of the difficult things that we fought from an applications perspective is all of these tools. I mean, there's more in the application space nowadays or higher up in the stack, but most of the traditional security tools were all, hey, on the lower layers, right? I mean, you've got a firewall.
It's a real problem.
Yeah. And then they encrypt all the HTTPS traffic, and guess what? Your WAF goes out the window because you're sniffing, right? You don't have that certificate or whatever else. Like, we've seen these problems happen again and again. So it sounds like you guys specifically have solved this more at the, hey, we're targeting specific layers.
Yeah.
So how much of that? So it sounds like that goes hand in hand with the threat hunting stuff that you do as well.
So we have different methodologies depending on the layer of the stack that we're doing the hunt in, and obviously some of these layers will kind of get tied together because certain attacks will show up on multiple layers, obviously. So say something runs on a user workstation, we might see this in our NetFlow logs, we'll see it in our EDR logs, we'll see it in our DNS logs, for example. And being able to tie those 3 unique signals together into one event or one indicator is basically what our threat hunting process helps us to define, so we can turn those into alerts later on.
Okay.
And EDR is that's endpoint detection and response, or
endpoint data recorder, whichever they want to use. Acronym.
Okay, data.
We know.
I just want to make sure I clarify.
Network, process and like disk reads and writes, like a number of tools in that category.
Does it's like Carbon Black and OS Query, those kind of fall into that?
Carbon Black, OS Query, Microsoft Sysmon is another good one in that category. Yeah, basically anything gives us visibility on that endpoint level where we can know what executed, when executed, did it make any network connections, did it resolve any DNS address names that we should be concerned about, stuff like this.
Yeah, I remember going back to Chris, he was saying that OS Query can be great, but it can also be very technically difficult to implement. That, again, I know so little about all of this, but I just know that I guess if you run OS Query, it does require a lot of tuning and customization to be useful at least from a few years ago. I think that's what he was saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's typical of any tool in that category. You need to know what you're looking for, and at minimum what you don't want to capture in this case, because that's where things tend to get tricky.
Okay.
Like in the case of Microsoft systems, for example, there are a number of folders that are just super noisy, and you'd never actually get the proper context from your logs unless these are heavily filtered. But at this point, and kind of speaking on the paved road section of security right now, a lot of people have put out rule sets for OS Query, for Carbon Black Detect, and also for Sysmon. They're really good baselines for moving forward. So that's something where I don't see as much of a barrier to entry anymore, because people have kind of put these things together for us and made it a bit easier.
Interesting.
I mean, so it sounds like massive amounts of data, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So I'm pretty sure, so talk a little bit about how you're actually managing everything that's coming in. You don't necessarily have to give specifics on tooling or whatever else, but what is the approach that you take to pulling this all in and actually running some sort of queries against it, like an elk stack style? Hey, we got a database, we got to be able to alert on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
the kind of first thing that I put in place here was our modern stack, this is elk, but not your traditional elk, in the sense that our traditional elk would be, Elasticsearch for search, Logstash to deliver the logs into Elasticsearch, and then Kibana for visualization and kind of getting some insight out of that data. So what we did differently in this case is we aren't using Logstash, we're using Kinesis. And we have a number of Lambda workers that will pull from numerous sources, both like third-party APIs, our own internal logs, and endpoint logs, and basically dump these all into a flat Elasticsearch database so we can search across everything. So if we have an IP address that we're concerned about, we can search for this in, our two-factor logs or SSO logs, our endpoint logs, and our NetFlow logs to see if there's any correlation there at all. So it's really useful in kind of stitching together different layers of the stack and seeing what's going on there.
Okay. And so what sort of recommendations do you give to your application teams then on, hey, this is the data that we need? Right. Like I know you're looking for indicators and you've got, specific processes for testing out like something like SQL injection. Hey, if it shows up in the log in this format, are you just telling your dev teams send us everything, or how is it that how do you interact with them in that case? Like we run into this all the time that, hey, we've got like operational logs and all they want to give us is this user logged in, this user logged out. Right?
Yeah.
So security events versus operational. As a cert person, I kind of feel like I'd want to see everything.
Exactly. That's what we want to do. So we're actually really lucky here in the sense that we're an engineering organization. So as long as you have a justified reason for needing something that's pragmatic, you usually don't get much pushback, right?
Okay.
I basically explained to folks what we can't do if we don't have that information and what the repercussions of not having that information would be. And they're usually pretty forthcoming with adding either additional log context to our own internal logs or providing a means to get that context through some other system. So in our case, they're actually pretty forthcoming with adding features. Say I want to know when new users have logged in for a new IP, for example. That's data they have in the app anyway, so they just surface that in logs so Cert can now consume that in the same log source that we were pulling in originally, just with a new field, for example. So instead of having to go build some tooling there to say, hey, let's count the last 30 IPs, is this a new one? They do that for us in app, so we don't do some of that processing. So there is that back and forth to add security context to any logs that the engineering side controls. And so far, it's worked out pretty well.
Cool. See, and I think, so just on the flip side, I do see organizations that instead of doing what you're saying, right, and actually going back and getting it put into the logs from the engineering org, they have a tendency to push it like into Splunk and then do manipulation of the logs and do counts and things like that to actually pull it out, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you don't have that interaction with the back-end team. So I was just wondering there because it's definitely
it comes up.
Yeah,
it definitely comes up. But I typically like to have those things as close to the source that's generating the alert as possible, some of that context, because the more processing that occurs away from that source, the less likely that is to be accurate and actionable, in my opinion. So that's something that I try to push as close down into the application as possible. That way, if we have to have someone else look at some of this data, they don't have to know how Splunk or Elasticsearch works. They can even look at the raw log source and say, hey, this looks suspicious. And that we can all be a bit Barrett security.
Cool.
Yeah, one of the questions Ken Toller had was, I don't know if you wanted to get into it, but basically he was asking, if someone says, I want to do Cert well, I'll rephrase it because he writes, so we want to do Cert well. I don't know what I'm looking for. How do you sort of build? I know that's because let's talk just about applications. What are some of the things that are sort of like easy signatures, just like bare basics. You don't know anything, but you're going to go in and you're going to build some signatures that are like, maybe a little bit scary. Are you looking for like 500 internal server error stack traces? Are you looking for like a certain, SQL?
Yeah, there are a
query in there
for sure.
What's that?
There are a number of things, like also obviously the error counts are one of them. But if you have any log source that there's unknown data there and you want to basically get a signal out of this, one of the first things I do is visualize this data, like in a few different ways to see kind of how the parameters or the data columns bubble up in terms of, do they group on certain columns? Can we see that this one thing is an anomaly because you have a spike in count, or if you have user agents decrementing instead of increasing for application security, for example, that's a clear sign that you probably have some using a proxy or some bot or some skid who's hard-coded a user agent. Just like little things like this that help you to detect, is it a human being? Is it something that is impossible for a human with a mouse and a keyboard to do? That helps to really expedite some of the rule creation for these unknown sources. Because anytime we onboard a new log source, there is about a couple weeks at least where we're visualizing this, getting familiar with that data, what does normal look like in that data set, and then reversing it to find any kind of anomalies that would exist there and tuning rules based on those. So there are a few basics, counts, errors, obviously. If you get 500, someone's probably trying something funny with your application, unless you have an unstable application. So there are a few things you can do, but it does come down to basics: grouping on count, grouping on various columns, and seeing how that data changes, and making note of that as you build your rules.
When you say visualize the data, are you using, because you had mentioned Kibana, is that sort of what you mean? It's like building the visual graphs to sort of like detect, so just visually you can see sort of.
So with Tableau or Kibana or anything else, basically any tool that helps you visually consolidate your log data into something meaningful. Because as human beings, I feel like it's much easier for us to see patterns when they're visualized and just in a raw tabular form. Sure, people can do it from a tabular form, but trust me, it's a lot easier when you have this visualized and color coded in front of you.
I do trust you because I don't know anything about this stuff, so I'm fascinated and learning today. It's super awesome. Love it. We had another question, which was if you had any experience using Chaos Search.
Chaos Search, I haven't, but is there any info you have about that?
I have none. I don't know anything about Chaos Search until today. I'd never heard of it. Again, I'm learning a lot today. So
that's the first time I've actually heard of this one. But on chaos testing, that is one of the ways we verify that our infrastructure will stand the test of time, basically. Like pulling out various components and seeing how it fails and whether or not we can be resilient to those failures. Because the worst thing you can have in like a logging system is to not have your logs arrive, for example.
So I guess this is using S3 instead of as the storage versus using like Elasticache or something like that.
Yeah, I ran into issues with using S3 as a data backend for our larger log sources, because I like to visualize, for example, a year's worth of data at once. And doing that via S3 can be fairly tedious, especially if you have a number of different keys that has to search across and kind of stitch those all together in a single view. So I found Elasticsearch to be really performant in that area, and that's basically why we went with that.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean that does make sense. It's like an in-memory type. Yeah, I mean, it's meant to perform and be optimized, whereas S3 is just sort of like a persistent storage. So, so this is the Elasticsearch compatible Chaos Search?
I'll look into it in any case, because I'm always looking for new tools and things to make my job easier, basically. So if this is going to do that, I'll definitely check it out.
So we'll have to have a follow-up to talk about it.
Yeah, because I don't know. Again, don't know anything about this. It's super interesting. Do you deal with account takeover, ATOs, account takeover operations, I think is what it's called, or something like that?
Yeah. So we get attempts for that a lot. When I mentioned the new login location detection, for example, it's one of the checks for this. For example, if someone hasn't logged in from that IP before, they will actually get a warning prior to logging in. They won't be able to directly log into this account. There'll be a waiting period, for example. And since we do have that signal in our logs that was added by our engineers, that helps us on Cert to say, hey, is this someone trying to take over an account? How often are we receiving this IP across other users, for example? Do we have one IP getting tied to 60 people within the last 20 minutes, for example, is a good signal for something like this. So we do see those types of attempts. I think any company who has a SaaS tool will face that problem at some point. And for companies who are making SaaS tools, if you're making a tool and you don't include some sort of audit logging in your tool, you're doing it wrong. And there are already a few who I see doing this.
Let's rewind a little bit. if you're building a new tool and you're not including audit logging, I don't care what the tool is.
If it's a
you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, anything that's holding data for either your employees or their customers, and it's a SaaS tool that does not provide any inbuilt logging or auditing, you are 100% doing it wrong, because those accounts can easily be taken over and you would never know.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, so, and this, I had another question here, which was like, I get the sense, and I don't know how accurate this statement is, that, you know, two-factor auth honestly would, I get the sense anyways, that oftentimes it would prevent these issues, but I'm not sure how accurate that is, or if it's if it's like a, hey, no, it's a little bit more fine-tuned than that, like it's SMS to FA versus like you know, and like Authenticator or Duo or something like that. You know, there's a big difference there. I honestly don't know, like if that's
yeah, I don't think there's a big difference in which 2FA mechanism they're using. People are always talking about how bad SMS for 2FA is, but how often are people really getting SIM swapped, right? How often is that really happening? I think it's a bit of like the fear-mongering aspect of it from maybe some of our companies who offer two-factor. I'm not going to say which, but any solution that gives you a second factor is better than nothing, obviously, and will help to, you know, kind of stymie the ATO attempts on most applications.
So it is,
yeah,
it is like something to sort of preach still. Like
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd almost think the SMS, like the SMS stuff, right? Like, yeah, if you're being targeted, right? If you have a fear that you're being targeted specifically for account takeover, then maybe that's one that you want to avoid. But in general, yeah, exactly what you're saying. I think I've never seen anything when talking to customers or even other AppSec people that, hey, this is way worse than using Duo or something else. So.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, but I think it's a lot of your job too, is figuring out, well, I don't want to like speak for you, but I would imagine a big part of your job is figuring out like what sort of attacks are we trying to prevent? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
Which is sort of your, actually this came up because my mother, I bought her some Nest stuff and we were talking about, I was like, just enable two-factor auth because like, I'm serious. It's a privacy issue. If someone guesses your, I'm sure, weak password that you use on every account, like you're going to have an issue. And so she's like, are you, you know, do you think it's that? I'm like, yeah. But then she was like, well, what do I do with these recovery codes? And I was like, you know what, just print them out and put it in a filing cabinet. That's not your risk profile, is not like you're worried about somebody breaking into your house. And that's like on a very, very small scale, I imagine, considerations that go into your job. Like what, you know, like, what are we really trying to prevent here? Who we, yeah.
I mean, so I've kind of broken ours into a few categories. Like there's the aspect of people obviously directly trying to do us harm, attacking us directly, or, you know, probing our resources directly. There are those who want to target our customers because they're using our platform. They can detect they're using our platform. And then people obviously using our platform for things like various forms of e-crime, right? So those are kind of the buckets I put our threats in. And then there are different detections we have across kind of each of those lanes, so to speak.
Makes sense.
So in general, how much time do you spend on, like, just in general, like how much time do you spend on like employee, like corporate style, like monitoring versus, you know, the SaaS tool monitoring, right? Like, how do you feel that workload is? Is it pretty much 50-50 or?
It's definitely 100% even across the board, since we control all those log sources. We manage those logs on Cert. So daily, pretty much we're doing hunts across, again, all layers of the stack. So we have our endpoint logs, NetFlow, and also like the SaaS and cloud level logs. And then that's an even split. We basically choose day to day. Like, where do we apply our time based on where we see the risk showing up? Okay. So pretty even split.
That's good to know, right? Like, I always wonder that, right? You'd have to do it based on risk, obviously, right? So some of the bigger companies, I almost feel like they have a tendency to feel like they're a bigger target than they necessarily are.
Yeah.
Or you have companies that think that they're like, oh, we're a startup, everybody's after us, and you know, our little 10-person office, people are targeting us like nation states. And you're like, really?
No, dude,
like,
actually,
you have financial data in the cloud, and you're little like, no one cares about your 10-person like.
It's usually opportunistic, honestly, from what I've seen.
It's funny you mentioned that.
for sure.
I was just about to ask you, like, at what point, like, at what size of a company, or maybe it's not size. Like, at what point does it make sense to have a one person, just the first person coming in to do cert related activities?
So honestly, I think it's one of the first security roles any team or any company should hire for. Mainly because while your security engineers are helping you have better infrastructure, or your AppSec engineers are helping your product be better, you need people day one to know what's going wrong, or with either side of that. We kind of act as a mirror to all other teams to see how well what they're implementing is actually working. And without that signal, without that measure, you can't really accurately know how well either of those teams are really doing in terms of how far your security is actually going. You can see that maybe people are getting the PRs approved at this point, but are those PRs actually introducing issues and things along those lines? So the visibility is key from day one, I think. And the sooner that companies have their head wrapped around that, the less issues they will see down the line. And the quicker to respond.
I mean, I know, Seth, we've talked about this before, where we're like, your first person. I could totally see the first security person being that cert role, because we've talked about this before, where people are like, well, we've been approached by startups and they're like, well, how much does it cost for an AppSec person? And like, should I get them, right now? And you're like, you've got 40 people. Don't worry about it. Like, unless your entire business centers around that, then yeah, like maybe it's a consideration, or maybe you just want to have a trustworthy consultant. But yeah, like, your first person shouldn't be a specialist in one domain, whereas like you have somebody who can, like you said, respond to and detect a variety of threats, but also that's the person who's going to classify what your risk is, what then based upon that risk is like pertinent to implement, and yeah, just I can totally see why you say that. I do not think like in very rare cases it makes sense for like your first person to be. I say AppSec, but I mean, I guess what would be like another specialist domain, like a red teamer, or like a physical pen tester, tiger team type, deal.
Yeah, I see a lot of orgs going that route as well, trying to get red teamers in a little sooner than I think they should, before they even understand what resources they have to be attacked. They're bringing in attackers, so that's kind of a weird thing I've seen on the uptick recently.
I have seen red teamers. I have like friends that are red teamers, and they're like, "Why did you, what here? You want your findings? Everything is a finding here. Like literally everything. Do you just want me to put everything in a report, and that's the end? Yeah. Like everything here is terrible. Like you need to let's back up a bit and actually implement some defense." So.
For sure.
So along those lines, what do you feel about MSS Peas? Right, like you've got a lot of startups that.
Wow.
Hey, this is like we have a whole like 10 people listening, so just go for it, right? Say whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm mixed on those, because at one point in my career I thought that's actually what I wanted to do. Basically democratize our security knowledge as something that other companies could benefit from. But over the years, I've gotten some feedback from friends who are either working at MSS Peas or work with MSS Peas, and in most cases, they're not really getting the value out of them that they'd expect. And that comes down to knowing the company, knowing the stack, right? A lot of the MSPs are like highly distributed across a number of organizations, and they never really do that deep dive that's necessary to like pull actionable signal out of any log sources people have. Or in other cases, they're only consuming alerts that have already been configured, and they're not exactly sure how that was configured, what the source of this is, has it been tuned, et cetera. They just respond. So I'm not really sold on them personally, but that's mainly because they don't have that close touch with the organization that helps them be successful, I think.
Yeah. I like the organizations that I've talked to about MSSPs before have always been, hey, you know what, if this is a stopgap for a year because you're just trying to get your hands around things, that's great. But the second that like that whole we're digging into every point of the stack, an MSSP is not going to do that, right?
Exactly.
They're probably not going to dig into the application logs to look and see what happens when 2FA goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're just not, because that doesn't apply across every single organization that they're dealing with. So, Yeah.
Yeah,
Take it with a grain of salt, I guess. Right?
Compliancing away your security type of a situation. Yeah. Kind of the same category for me.
That's never a problem, Louis. Come on, it's fine. Right? Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I mean, I used to work for a company that like gave out cybersecurity insurance, so that was an interesting gig at that point, with seeing how people will prioritize, getting a security policy, which is like an insurance policy instead of a real security policy in place, more so than hiring a team and building out that functionality internally. And the irony is, the insurance is always more expensive and doesn't actually protect you from anything real in that case.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I'm trying to phrase this question. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question. If you don't have the money for an MSSP, I guess, and you want to balance your security roles out, this is a tough question. How would you go about doing that?
So allocation of resources, I guess, is like the core question to that. If you have a limited budget, limited resources in general, how do you best allocate those to be successful from a detection and response standpoint?
Right.
I've always been a big supporter of kind of four-man security. I always try to build with nothing before asking for even a cent, and kind of to prove that this can be done. So, like I mentioned with the whole paved road aspect of things, there are a lot of tools and services out there right now that are free and open source that will get people maybe 60% of the way there. And then they'll just have to hire a person to get familiar with those tools maybe, and extract the maximum value out of them, right? So it is easier than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago to do this on the cheap. Mm-hmm. So I would say, invest in open source tools, reach out to the community, see what folks are using in that area. Because it is tricky. Security folks are expensive. We all know this. And if you want to actually balance that efficiently, you really will have to lean heavily on automation, use open source tools, and again, reach out to experts in the community who are usually pretty open to discussing this type of stuff and best practices, because they enjoy it, they're passionate about it, and they're willing to help.
And because you mentioned it earlier, and you just talked about having open source resources, I'm linking to, I think you called it Paku, is that the way to say it, from Rhino Security Labs?
Yeah. So that's cool. A really nice assessment tool. I don't see too many that do cloud stuff well. I was actually taking a look at Metasploit the other day to see what tools they had that were AWS targeted. There may be 2 modules, one to spin up an instance and one to dump S3 buckets or something. But there weren't many in that area other than Paku that I saw that were really well fleshed out. So kudos to Rhino Security.
Very cool. Yeah, no, I know they put I remember when they released it, I think it was a couple years ago. They had put a lot of time and energy into it, and to make it a pretty good tool. So it looks like it's still, let me see. It looks like it's still actively maintained.
Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, somewhat.
And just a shameless plug here. I did a talk at AWS Community Day a few months ago. This was another paved road talk, and this is basically bootstrap security monitoring in a brand new AWS account, or one that you already have some resources in. And that basically gets you up to the point where you don't need to invest millions in a Splunk or a Sumo Logic, for example, and can use open source tools to get you at least 80 or 90% of the way there, and get some visibility built around things.
Are there videos or slides available for that at all?
Yeah, definitely. I can send you guys a link after the show if you want to include those.
Yeah, we can add it in the description of the video so people can click on it later.
Cool.
So I can find it. Cool. Man, I feel like I've learned so much today. I really do. It's awesome. Because I've always wanted, I'm super happy that we got hooked up with you through Leaf. Because I think Cert is such a difficult job, and it's not one that's well understood or known, I don't feel, by a lot of people, including myself. Like I said, a lot of what I do is just sort of handing it off, and then they do their wizardry on the back end, and that we either get the thumbs up or we're gonna have to send out a notification or something, So, but what happens in between those time periods, that's a little bit more of a mystery. So this has been super fascinating and helpful.
Yeah, and we always get that from the AppSec side of things. We always talk about the AAA like authentication, authorization, and auditing, like you're logging and actually like giving data to the cert. But it gets short shrift, right? We talk about this in secure code review all the time. That people are like, oh, it's just logging, right? Like you don't really need to worry about it. And I'm like, no, this is a serious issue. So it's great to kind of highlight that. And
Definitely.
I mean, we've been going for over an hour now. Like we want to make sure that we respect your time there, Louis.
I'm good. I actually have my morning threat hunt immediately after this, but I delegated that one before starting this call, so I'm all good there.
Actually, one last question, since you've talked a lot about delegation and leadership and mentorship, any good leadership books that you've read that you would recommend, or any resources?
Oh, I haven't read too many in that area. It's always been kind of an organic thing. If I see someone who kind of has the similar interests that I had at the time, or is just really passionate about security, I'm always totally willing to help folks like really flesh out their experience in that area. And like I mentioned before, you never know how what you teach someone will actually like benefit you later on. They might find something you never would have noticed, or teach you something by merging their experience with what you've taught them. So it's always really valuable. I encourage others to do more of that.
Nice. Yeah, like finding that Arabic string that is important signature.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, where can people find you? Because I don't have a Twitter handle for you. So
yeah, I tend to do like glass separation between like my previous security research and my professional life now. But yeah, if anything, they can always shoot me an email. I'm fine with that. More so than Twitter these days. It can be a bit of a dumpster fire occasionally. So I try.
Oh God, you know what? I don't want to get too off topic, but I've stopped. I turned off my notifications. I've stopped paying attention to Twitter. Is just so
it can be a bit distracting too. So like I like to focus and get things done more so than engage in what I see as fairly pointless discussion on open source tools.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're referring to, and we won't even bring it up. So cool. Yeah. So, and that's the thing too, is like there are so many people doing amazing work, and but they're quiet and not public, and so it's sometimes.
Well, this went around just recently, right? Like even on Twitter, somebody, I can't remember who it was that brought up the fact that the InfoSec scene is not necessarily the InfoSec industry, right?
Exactly.
Andrew Wilson.
Yeah, that's who it was. It was Andrew, who's been on the podcast, right? But there's so much kind of crap that goes on in the scene that's not helpful to our everyday as far as, hey, like the actual work that we're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, someone mentioned like a couple months ago that's really not helpful for people to even like check out InfoSec Twitter half of the time, because you have, so much of the shit posting and memes. And when you're actually looking for like valuable information as someone coming into this as a newbie, it's really hard to find. So I've started to like pull away from the Twitter side of things and like, spend my time going to meetups and talking to folks there more so than, over the Twitter channel at this point.
Yeah. So what meetups, like where could people actually, like if they're in the Bay Area, where could they find you?
Oh, sure. So, we'll be at B-Sides SF this year, obviously. I'm in the East Bay, so there are a few East Bay meetups that I'll attend. Like we have HoodSec, for example. That's a pretty good one. Just basically any of these smaller meetups that are fairly focused around security.
Cool.
Sweet. Okay. I'm posting links to. Cool. Yeah. Trying to make sure this gets out there. Awesome. So sorry, you're not going to AppSec Cali. Any other conferences you think you'll like, any AWS or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll probably be at Locomoco. I do DEF CON every year just to see what people are up to. It's always a lot of fun. Usually avoid some of the lines there and just kick it in the suite. But DEF CON, B-Sides SF, try and do Locomoco. And I usually do HushCon, both East and West every year.
Well, I'll hit you up for DEF CON. I might be at Locomoco Sec. And by the way, Seth, Locomoco Sec, it's a security conference that occurs in Hawaii.
Can't beat that.
Oh, sorry. This is the longest running troll, and I'm not sorry because it's hilarious. So anyways, I might be at Locomoco, but definitely DEF CON, I'm going to hit you up so we can meet in person,
That's
say hi
yeah.
to you. So
Yeah, and I'll be at B-Sides SF, so we'll chat there, and DEF CON for sure, right? Like I'll be doing Hacker Tracker stuff as well.
Nice.
We'll do an absolute AppSec drinks or something like that.
Dope, man. Sounds good to me.
any parting thoughts you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, just be excellent to each other, really. I mean, when I moved out here to the Bay, it was because someone kind of sold me on the city. I visited Noise Bridge, kind of looked around. There was one guy there who was like, hoodie up, working on something. So, I reached out to me, and we were actually working on similar projects. Just by like reaching out, being like kind to folks, being inclusive in the industry, you will go a lot further than you will if you're, kind of being cagey and anti. I'll put it that way.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, definitely. Like for the first half of my career, I was like really sort of quiet and maybe even mistrusting and just like. But yeah, I mean, by being a little bit more, like you said, I totally agree with that. It's helped. I think it's helped just growth by a lot to just be like more social and what you talked about, going to meetups and actually like talking to people face to face has a huge impact. So
yeah.
Thank you for your time today. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
For having me.
Awesome. Anything, Seth, before we hop off?
No, any of the previous guests though, that if they didn't get a t-shirt, please let us know. Reach out to us, hit us up on, you can find us on Twitter, because it's the dumpster fire that we all prefer. Or Slack channel, absoluteappsec.com, or send us an email, like, around the episode or whatever it is. We'd love everybody to have one. That's why we get them. And yeah, otherwise we'll see everybody next week. And yeah, thanks again for your time, Louis. And appreciate the thoughts and the comments. So.
And I just sent you an email asking for just a reminder about the address and t-shirt size. So we make sure we get you one, because otherwise our old brains will forget. So, all right. Thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Awesome.